so great to be back. I was here, I think it was about 2 years ago for the very first time. You can take that mic down and the wedge here. I don't need it up here. And you guys are just incredible hosts, incredible heart for God, and I hope you can understand my accent. Because listening to Angus last night, I lost about a third, even though he was using the English language. So I hope you don't lose a third of what I want to share. And I want to just share a little bit of my heart and story and theology on worship and mission. And it was a huge privilege to finally get here yesterday after I missed my original flight, so it took me 62 hours to get here. But I'm glad to be here finally. Our view of who God is and his character will be the defining heart of our worship and the expression of our mission in the world. Because I believe that every act of worship and every act of mission just simply reveals who we believe God to be. And our world is full of worship and mission, though often it's not the worship, it's often the worship of other gods rather than the God of Scripture. And it's interesting even to hear more of the language of worship and mission in the arts and business world. It's like an acknowledgement increasingly that worship and mission are at the heart of what it means to be human. And I'm hearing it a lot more in all kinds of different settings. But, you know, there's a lot going on in our world, and everybody, well, a lot of people believe in God of some sort and are doing things to reveal the God that they believe in to the world around them. And you know, people who commit acts of terror do it deeply believing they are serving God. It's just a different God. And I want to say this right up when I make that comment, that it's maybe really easy for Christians to point their finger at Islam and people on its radical fringes. But the sad thing is, in the last 20 centuries, the body count is a lot higher for people who have killed in the name of Christ than it is in the name of Allah. Have you ever thought about that? And, you know, so in our modern world, people are, if they can't get away with murder or physical violence, they're going to do, you know, other things. They're going to find ways to commit violence with their words, believing they are serving God and being his moral police. And so the hope of the nations is not an unleashing of morality, but of compassion, of healing, of forgiveness. Is violence going to solve more of the nation's problems? That's why so many people stumbled when Jesus came. So many of his own people stumbled because they wanted him to overthrow the Romans with violence. And I want to just turn to Matthew chapter 12. If we could put this up on the screen. The key passage I wanted to just preach on briefly is Isaiah 40, but just as an introduction, I want to read this. Matthew 12, verse 15, a large crowd followed him, and he healed all who were ill. He warned them not to tell others about him. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. But here's how he brings it. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he has brought justice through to victory. In his name The nations will put their hope. Isn't that an incredible, telling, prophetic description of our Messiah and our King? He will be a servant, not initially a ruler. He will be filled with the Spirit to proclaim justice, not by overpowering people with a shock and awe campaign. He will not quarrel, which means to try and forcibly convince everyone that he is right. I think that he will not cry out. It's not like he comes demanding his own way. He will not crush or overpower fragile people. And those with a faint hope, he will not condemn for being weak. That's our King. And our world still desperately needs that revelation. There's coming, a day of reckoning, a day when justice will be fully and completely released. Shalom will be established. But until that day, I really believe, especially from the marking of the coming of the Messiah, his work is marked with a servanthood and a gentleness that releases powerful change. I want just take a moment to tell you a little bit of my story. God has blessed me with an amazing wife, Joyce, and they're not with me, so I brought along a couple of pictures. Can you throw those pictures up behind me? We've been married for almost 27 years. We got married when we were children. No, well, I waited till 1 week after I turned 19 so I could sign my own marriage thing. Go on to the next picture. That's my wife and our 4 beautiful daughters. Joy is in the front. She's 16 and she's going to be a chef. Esther is 21. She works with handicapped students. My wife Joyce, my daughter Rachel, who just got married, and Mercy in the back corner. Go on to the next picture. And I have been immensely blessed with 2 mentally handicapped sons who have a condition called Fragile X syndrome and don't speak much. This is my 20-year-old son Benjamin and my 12-year-old son Isaiah. Isaiah, we call, he has many nicknames, but he's the Happy Destroyer. And his arms are wide because he wants to give you a hug. There's basically no adult, no person that can come within range of Isaiah and escape the hug. And then one more picture. Yeah, this is the wedding of our daughter on our property 2 months ago. And that's Luke. We say the gospel has arrived in our family. And because if he's willing to marry into our family, he must be an incarnation of the gospel. He just so happens to be a guitar player and a worship leader and an up-and-coming songwriter who fell in love with my daughter across the class at Bible school, had no idea even when he heard her name was Rachel Doerksen that she had any connection with this Brian guy who writes worship songs. So he fell in love with her, and anyway, he's an amazing guy. As I said, my wife and I got married when I was 19, and I remember the passion and the desire to see God impact the nations. And I remember so distinctly our wedding day, running out of the back of the church and just so believing in what God was going to do and in what he was going to do in the future. And I realized in the last few years that I never signed up for a lot of what came along with it. Right? It's not like when I was, the day of marriage, running out the back, and there's a sign-up table. We were really good at sign-up tables at church, aren't we? So you stop on the way out and you sign up and say, I'd like to have handicapped children. Yep. Check, sign me up for that. I'd like to go through basically complete financial ruin and collapse trying to do a ministry project that fails. Yep, sign me up for that. Like you could go through the list, your list of what you've gone through. How many of you would have picked those things in advance? No. We don't choose some of the suffering and the grace in disguise that comes into our life in advance. But let me tell you, those things, and they're different for all of us, are so incredibly core to shaping us to be more like our Messiah, who does not snuff out a smoldering wick, who does not come to the weak and condemn them for their weakness. And I'm so immensely blessed by these expressions of God's grace in disguise that's come into our life. And we continue to struggle in various ways and continue to see victory in various ways. Life is a thing of all of those things. And one of the struggles we're going through right now, even with a former pastor and friend who is suing me and our lead pastor because he believes that I'm a moral and theological failure. And it's his job to prove in court that he's right. And that's what we're right in the middle of right now. One of the men who helped plant our church 5 years ago is suing us. And I want you know, I understand the desire to prove you are right. I just know that when it comes to worship and mission, proving we are right will never accomplish the work of God. It's another example of one of the things I didn't sign up for. Huh? When you become a pastor, leader, there's lots that comes with it. You know, I'm by nature, I'm a visionary. I want to win. And I believe that drive to sort of create new things and accomplish things is a very, very healthy, good thing. But I want to say, this is what the key message I felt like I was to share with you today. If we want to experience God's best, the best thing, which I believe is the glory of God, the love of God. It's the glory of God experienced in his presence, and it's the love of God manifest to the world. If that's the best, we're going to have to learn to surrender and find a way to embrace the lowly so that we can experience love and glory together. Because we're not going to experience it by proving we're right. So let's look at Isaiah 40 for a moment, because I believe this is a very key prophetic description of course, what Jesus fulfilled. But there's a couple of things in here that have been life to me, and I pray that they are for you. Isaiah 40, verse 1, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. Proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for. Oh, I love this. 1,000 years or more before Christ. Her sin has been paid for, that she has received from the Lord and had double for all her sins. A voice of one calling, in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all mankind together will see it. That's a pretty big promise. And I think when the prophet is speaking of valleys and mountains, is he speaking of geography? Or is he speaking of people? And if it's geography, what is the purpose of altering that geography if not to better serve people? Well, let me flip that over, the geography of our culture, the arcs and the way our culture works, at least in my home country of Canada, the culture does not naturally want to raise up the lowly. And the mountains don't necessarily want to bow down or to kneel down and serve. You see, what is natural to us is, when we talk about people, is the elevating of stars and the shaming of sinners. Those two things are very, very easy for us to do. Elevating stars and shaming sinners. They come naturally to us, especially the shaming part. But they're connected. They're connected. And the amazing thing about our God, Yahweh, Yeshua, the God of the Scriptures, is He does neither of those things. He honors. He honors. But He doesn't elevate. I love what Angus talked about last night about nobodies. Because then God gets the glory. Right? I grew up, I'm from a little town called Abbotsford, British Columbia. It's about a little over 100,000. I'm very, very intensely shy by nature. When I was a boy, if my parents had guests over, I would hide. They'd have to drag me out to meet them. My greatest fear was that I'd have to get up in front of people and talk or do something. I would do everything within my power to avoid being in front of people. Even now, if I'm in a situation like a wedding or something and somebody will say, "Hey, Brian, give a speech," I'm terrified. The only way I can function in what I do is simply because I simply ask God for grace to do it, and I do it. And I feel great peace and welcome here, and I don't feel nervous. But half an hour ago, I was very nervous back over there. It's like, it's like that ongoing, do I have to? But on that journey, I think sometimes God picks the nobodies and the least likely, because we can then, there's a way in which we connect and relate with other nobodies, other people that are struggling with some of the same things, versus the people that just, they're born performers, they're born achievers. And that wasn't me. Do you believe you can learn deep theology from Twitter? How many of you are Twitterers in South Africa? It's like, only a handful of people even want to admit it. It's awesome because, no, I'm not talking about following celebrities. I mean, I've discovered some of the best sort of Christian authors and pastors in the last couple of years on Twitter. And because you have to say what you want to say in 140 characters or less. Do you guys understand how Twitter works? I don't know. I don't want to do a Twitter workshop. But anyway, there is one that's a tweet, they call it, in Twitter land. A tweet that has been living in my spirit for the last few months, ever since I read it. It's been tweeting around in there. And it comes from an author and a pastor from St. Joseph, Missouri, a little town about an hour out of Kansas City. And his name is Brian Zond. And he just tweeted this one day. Jesus doesn't divide the world into good and bad, just proud and humble. And I'm sitting there, oh my goodness. And then I started thinking about the Gospels, and I started thinking about the exchanges that Jesus had with people. And it's this connection between Isaiah 40 and Jesus. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's the truth. Remember the story of John 9, Jesus healing a man born blind? Do you remember that story? Jesus is walking down the road, and the disciples see a problem. Someone begging. And the disciples, instead of helping, decide the most important thing to do is talk about who's to blame. Remember that story? Of course, none of us ever do that. Because in the disciples' mind, somebody must be right and somebody must be wrong. Someone must be bad and somebody must be good. And that's how they divide the world. And I think Jesus divides, but not in the way we do. Isn't that an amazing comfort? And I'm not going to read the story because I don't have time right now, but at the end of it, Jesus turns to the Pharisees who were giving such grief to this man who was healed. And he says this, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin, but now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. So it ends with Jesus talking about guilt. And according to Jesus, the guilty are those who claim to be right. Those who claim to see everything, that's a good word, everything correctly. Those who constantly say, I know. Okay, parents, do you ever have this issue with your children where you start telling them something and the first thing out of your child's mouth is, I know. Okay, any other, or is it just Canadian kids that do this? And so then you have to gently try and correct that out of them, that concept of, why don't you wait until I actually finish what I wanted to say? And, I actually made a silly song about it for my daughter, my oldest daughter, when she was a child. She would just not get out of the habit. So as soon as she would say, I know, I would start singing, if you don't know how the west wind blows, ask Rachel. And I'd start describing in a silly song all the mysteries of the universe, and then I'd end with, she's cute, she's smart, she knows each part of life's grand mystery. If you don't know how the west wind blows, ask Rachel. Dad! And I was just trying to teach her, actually, Rachel, you don't know. There's lots of things you don't know. And if you read this story in John 9, there's all the times the Pharisees are saying, we know God doesn't speak to sin. We know. There's this kind of certitude. We know. And there's Jesus saying, well, if you were blind, you would not be guilty. But you claim that you see, you know everything. That's why humility is probably the most important character quality in the life of a follower of Jesus. God's call is for all of us to love others humbly. And let me tell you, it's impossible to love others proudly. It cannot be done. With whatever we have, influence, skills, gifts, resources, so that the lowly experience the favor and the forgiveness of God our Father. And that act of love for the proud mountain to be brought low, because pride blocks the way to loving relationships with God and with all those around us made in God's image. It's an act of love to raise up valleys, to use strength not to overpower, but to redeem, to protect, to serve. That's what it means to be a man. To use your strength not to overpower women, but to protect and serve them. One of the most terrifying things that's happening in our world is the plague of human trafficking. And we're going to see a friend when we fly next out of South Africa to Amsterdam who works with human trafficking. And I just saw a film called The Whistleblower, an incredibly disturbing but enlightening film about human trafficking in Eastern Europe. And the thing that just, as I walked out of that cinema, I was just reeling with the fact of what men do with their strength to overpower instead of to use that strength to serve and protect.